All right, let's give a round of applause for Len.
Yeah, like Bob said, my name's Les Odell. I'm from West Virginia. Like he calls me a researcher. I don't exactly call myself a researcher. I'm more of just a crazy dude that likes to go out and look at anything else that's crazy. But I've got to know a lot of the folks that were here, you know, the Fayette County area through Fred and Bob, doing events with them and hanging out with them, doing a little bit of investigating with them at times. And, I'll go.
Yeah, speak up a little bit, Len.
All right.
How you guys doing? Good.
But yeah, I just like to look into different things. A lot of people wonder how most people get started into this stuff. I got started a little different. You know, when it comes to Bigfoot, I got started a little different than what a lot of other people do. A lot of times you hear people like, all the experience I've had, or it was from watching In Search Of, or the Patterson-Gimlin film, something like that. Mine was just completely different. I never had really much of an interest in Bigfoot until probably close to 10 years ago. But how I got started into everything was an experience I had as a kid. I had a paranormal experience, I guess you'd say. I had an experience with what a lot of people call a shadow figure. I was 8 years old. Moved into this house. We lived there for a little while, and I would go to bed. Well, first off, when we first moved into this house, it was 1800 some farmhouse, built in like 1850 something, somewhere in that neighborhood, and I had the weirdest feeling that there's something watching me in this house. I just had, you know, and a lot of people were like, oh, it was an overactive imagination of a kid, but things started to happen. I started to see different stuff. Then my brother and I shared a bedroom, and we had the bunk beds. You know, I don't know, all the guys like you guys are into paranormal stuff. You hear there's always weird, strange stories around. For some reason, around bunk beds. I don't know, have no idea why. But the house was old enough that didn't have switches for the lights and stuff. We had push buttons. We actually had an outhouse. I used an outhouse. You know, even though I'm only 51 years old, I had an outhouse. But the weird thing, or the coolest thing about that switch that went in our bedroom, is when you pushed it, there was something goofy with the contacts in it, and it would stay on for 2 to 3 seconds before it went off. And I was happy that happened because I could just run to my bed and just jump in there. Like I said, I felt like something was always watching me in the house. Well, after being there a little while, I'm in the bottom bunk. My brother was on the top bunk. I started noticing these shadows. Like, just say the doorway is like where I'm standing. The wall was like this, and then our bed was over in the corner, and there was a window straight across. And I started noticing shadows that would walk and move across the wall. Didn't have any form to them, just weird, blobby-looking shadows. And it scared me to death. I tried to cover my head up, you know, scream for my dad, or I tried to scream for my dad and I couldn't. I'd cover my head up and I just wished they'd go away. And eventually I'd fall asleep or I'd look and they were gone. Well, that happened a few times, and then there was one night that I remember looking over, seeing the shadows start to move. And before I could cover my head up, I noticed in the corner there was a much taller shadow. And this one had form. This one looked like a human form, except it wasn't an entire body form. So it was basically from the waist up. You could see the arms, the shoulders, the chest. You know, head, all that stuff. The legs down, where the legs would be, but just like a solid mass. And it did again. I couldn't scream for my dad. I'd cover my head up, and eventually I noticed it go away. Yeah. He gets. Sorry about that. That's all right.
Sorry.
And well, this happened a few times. It happened a few times, and every time it happened, it just, like I said, I was paralyzed. Or not paralyzed. I was just paralyzed in fear. I wasn't going through sleep paralysis, what people were thinking of, because I was able to move. Well, I remember 3 times it happening distinctively. I mean, I can remember every time for those 3 times, and I don't know why just 3 times I remember really well, but the 3rd time I looked over and seen the shadows start to move, and the next thing I know, I see this thing standing in the corner again. And this time, instead of like covering my head up and, you know, trying to hide, I actually sit up in my bed and scoots back into the corner. And when I did, this thing went from looking you know, all these other times it looked like it was just watching these other ones. It went from looking down toward the wall or down along the wall to turn toward me, and within an instant, come across the room, ducked underneath the bunk bed, and was within 8 to 10 inches from my face, probably this far. And it leaned in. I could see the arms. I could see him put his hands down on the bed, and it was there. To me, probably it felt like forever, but probably only a few seconds. And it was the same shape as a human or a person, but there's no features. There were no facial features. It just had the head, the shoulders, the arms. I could see the chest area. And the weirdest thing about it, because I hear people talk about shadow people being blacker and black, you know, darker than the dark room. Well, yeah, it was, but this one wasn't like this. Wasn't like solid in color, I guess you'd say. It was shade, like you hear people talk about a shadow. This thing had inside the shape, there was like this, almost like a smoke-looking stuff, and it moved. It rolled around inside the shape. And it was years later. Actually, it was 2 years ago, because I've never heard anybody else describe that. And 2 years ago, I was at a library talk up in Mannington, West Virginia, and this lady, I told the same story, the lady comes up to me and she goes, I've experienced that. She goes, it happens at my house. And she called it a smoke demon is what she called it. So I don't know what it really was, but that's how I got started. How I got into paranormal stuff. I got my interest got piqued later on because of that. Started reading books. I'd listen to people tell stories. People would start coming out to or approaching me to tell me their stories, even if I was a teenager, and they started telling me stories, and I got more into it. And then later in probably in my 20s, that's when I got the interest of trying to investigate stuff. And back then, 30 years ago, people didn't, the ghost hunter stuff wasn't around and stuff like that. But I would, talk to people about their stories. I would try to figure out what was going on. And then the ghost hunter stuff come out, and that whole thing boomed. And at that time, my oldest son, was probably 10 or 11 years old. And he would come over, because his mom and I were divorced. He would come over and we, do things on the weekends. And I asked him one day, I said, what do you want to do this weekend? And he goes, I want to go ghost hunt. And I thought that was cool. That's just cool as hell. So we went out, and I took him. At first we bought the little tape recorders and stuff like that. And I bought those. Then I ended up voice recorders and bought a couple cameras. And he and I did that for a few years. And then we kind of decided to put together a group, and there was 4 of us all together. And we started investigating homes, and we started investigating businesses, pieces of land. One of our favorite ones was the haunted tunnel up in West Virginia, or the church called the Highland Church, which supposedly has a witch's grave. We would go there a lot. And then life happens, and the group kind of split up. Me and my son still done a lot of things together. And then one day we're talking to each other. And he goes, do you, what do you think about Bigfoot? And I'm like, I know the subject. I said I never looked into it, because when I was a kid, besides the only cryptid I really liked was besides dealing with the ghost stuff, because I liked the Loch Ness monster. I don't know why, but I just thought it was cool. But anyway, he started talking to me about Bigfoot, and I'm like, yeah, that's a pretty cool subject. And he's like, well, I've been listening to a lot of podcasts. He said, I'm getting into it. So we started talking about it a lot. And eventually, I started listening to podcasts and stuff like that. Then we decided we're going to start a page on Facebook for people in West Virginia to share their stories about Bigfoot, ghosts, whatever. It didn't matter, but we called it WV, with West Virginia Cryptids and Strange Encounters. After that got started, people started to send us stories. They started to send us all kind of weird stories. Whether it was a different type of cryptid, whether it was ghost stories, whether it was Bigfoot stories, whether it was UFO stories, alien stories, it didn't matter. They would send it to us. And eventually it seemed like it just morphed just to Bigfoot. A lot of people started commenting or started sending me stories about their Bigfoot encounters, or they wanted me to come out and check out their properties. I would do that, and eventually, I don't know, I just turned into, or got to be like one of the people in West Virginia that everybody came to talk to. And then one day I went to Flatwoods, West Virginia. Anybody know the Flatwoods Monster story? Well, the Flatwoods Monster story happened September 12, 1952. It was like this supposedly cryptid, but it's more alien related, UFO related than anything else. But anyway, I'm real good friends with the curator of the museum in Sutton, outside of Flatwoods. And I went down, I was talking to him, and he said, hey, he said, they got down there to Mount Laurel Country Store, he said, they got a Bigfoot costume down there that they use for promotion and stuff. He said, I know you're into Bigfoot. And I'm like, yeah. So I walked in, and I just looking around trying to be nonchalant about why I was there. And the guy, the owner of the store goes, hey, he said, can I help you? I'm like, I just looked at him and said, I hear you got a Bigfoot costume. And this guy, I mean, sadly he passed away. He passed away I think 3 years ago now. But he's patriotic dude, no BS, he's straight to the point. And he looks at me and goes, who the hell are you and why do you want to know? And I was like, well, I'm like, well, I got the interest in that. And then all of a sudden his son comes out, walks over, and his son's a big old boy, he's probably 6'4", 6'5". And he said, hey Dad, he said, that's the guy you've been watching on YouTube about Bigfoot in West Virginia. And his dad realized, who I was at the time, which, was just a few little videos here and there. But he said, then they started talking to me. We got into discussions about Bigfoot in West Virginia, about other Bigfoot in other areas and stuff like that, and Bigfoot in general. And in one of our discussions after we built a friendship, they were like, hey, we think it'd be cool to have a museum here in West Virginia. I'm like, yeah, that would be awesome. There's museums across the United States. One here in West Virginia would be cool. I mean, because there's just, the subject in West Virginia wasn't as big as what it is here in Pennsylvania or Ohio. People had their sightings, and people would talk to you eventually, but they just didn't do it. It just wasn't as open. 5 or 6 years ago, you didn't hear about Bigfoot in West Virginia very often, unless you was in like a closed circle. It's not like come up here to Fred. Fred started this group, and other was, and like other people in Ohio, they just didn't do it. So he's like, we'd like to open a museum. And I'm like, absolutely. I said, I will donate anything I got, reports that I've taken, the few casts that I've taken. I said, we'll get this going. I think it's awesome. I think it's awesome for the subject, awesome for tourism, in West Virginia, awesome for the little town of Sutton. I think it'd be great. So we did, and it started, we opened this museum in a room probably, maybe not quite as big as this one. Started with 5 casts, and that's it, not 5 casts. And a couple chainsaw carvings. Well, now it's 3 rooms. It's grown to 3 rooms, a lot of casts and a lot of other stuff, and some books and stuff like that, and some memorabilia from different cases, like the Falk Monster. They've started into things like that. But we decided there was during this, or I can't say we, David, the owner's son, decided when we were standing there talking to these newspaper or magazine editors that were in there wanted to do an interview. He said, hey, well, let's put together a festival. And this is during the soft opening of the museum. And I'm like, yeah, that'd be great. His mom's like, yeah, that'd be great. When we want to do it? He said, how about the hard opening of the museum? And I looked at him and said, that's 3 freaking weeks away, man. 3 weeks. So in 3 weeks, I was one to put all together all the speakers and stuff. They got the vendors and stuff. And the town itself didn't want it. They didn't want it. They didn't. It was taboo to them. It was nonsense. It was going to be a hassle. And then they're like, nobody's going to show up. There's not going to be a single soul here. We got the fire department in, to agree to serve food. They went out and bought enough food for 200 people, enough to serve 200 like hot dogs and stuff. Time for the festival to start, 15 minutes they were out of hot dogs. So they were panicking. They went to Walmart. They went to I think it was Walgreens down the road and some other stores. They bought every hot dog and stuff up. And so in 3 weeks, put together a festival that brought in 1,500 people for that little town. Second year we put it together, we did the same thing. I got the speakers together. There was 4,500 to 5,000 people. Third year it was 8,000 people. Last year was between 20 and 30,000 people. And we moved it from town to the Holly Gray Park outside of Sutton. So this year they're expecting probably anywhere from upwards of 30 to 40,000 people to be there for the 3-day event. And so that's how I got started in that part of it. But as far as investigating, like I said, it was when people would call me and I'd go out and check stuff out. Fred was a lot of help, when up here, we got with Fred. Fred, Bob, the Seaches, got to know them. When I got interested in the subject, I think it was Beaver Creek, up at Bigfoot Days or whatever up there, whatever it's called. They were putting a free event, and that's where I met Fred for the first time, and I met Brian Seach and Terry Seach, because I thought it was cool. These guys are doing this, and nobody in West Virginia is doing it. Oh, except for one person that was out there saying he's a Bigfoot guy. Fred knows him. We won't,
Piece of shit.
It's kind of like the Harry Potter thing. It's he whose name we do not speak of.
Everybody knows who it is.
Yeah. So I got into, like I said, going to people's properties. There's been some wild stuff happened that has nothing to do with Bigfoot. It happened to some weird people. So that's what I want to tell a lot of people is, when you go do these investigations, do your due diligence. Know where you're going. Let somebody else know where you're going. And because my wife gets kind of PO'd at me because I do most of it by myself. I got some friends now in the southern part of the state that I do stuff with, and around one around Morgantown. But the majority of the investigations and stuff I do by myself. And I would go to these people's homes, and I would hike the property. I'd talk to the people. And I've run into some weird stuff, some weird people. But that doesn't mean they didn't experience something. Sometimes there's what I call uber believers. People will, everything is Bigfoot related. And it could be just common, something natural, but it's Bigfoot related. So that's why I tell people, when you go out and do this stuff, use your common sense, use a logical mind. Debunk most of what you can, and make sure you guys been paranormal. And that's people ask me, why do you do it that way? I said, because that's how I started with the paranormal. You debunk everything you can, and then you try to find what's not. You try to, how do I want to put this?
Simplest explanation.
Yeah, simplest explanation, but how do I want to put it? You try to debunk. I'm trying to think
Try
of how
to
I want
just
to say
prove
it.
everything along the way.
Yeah. What I'm trying to say is, first you have to disprove what you're trying to prove.
Process of elimination.
Yeah, in a way. Try to disprove everything else, and then you can't disprove it. Then you can prove what you're experiencing or what you're finding. I'm not a big proponent on structures at all. I'm really not. I have found some weird things, and there are some things that are hard to explain. But most of the things I have found, there's usually a reasonable explanation where you can kind of dismiss it because of certain things. The only structures that I really have taken a real notice to are the ones you'd see that have what they call the floating beam. I don't know if you guys know what I mean by the floating beam. You'll have a TP or something structure, and usually through the middle there's just a straight beam that goes across, and it's kind of hard to explain how it got there between all these other interwoven branches.
It's not touching the ground, and it's
Right.
kind of held in place just by the friction, right?
Yeah, they call it the floating beam. Those ones I'll look at. Tree bows and stuff, majority of those, they're usually natural. The only one that I've ever looked at that I can't figure out is one that I actually found looked like claw marks and muddy fingerprints on it. and I have pictures of it, but I just didn't have them with me tonight. Tree breaks. I've been to many different places where people talk about tree breaks, and I actually went to Ohio here a while back to hike around with some investigators up there, and they're talking about tree breaks. And I just did this same thing in Summersville, West Virginia, with some guys showing tree breaks. They're talking about tree breaks, and I could show them each and every time where there was a scarred part on the tree, which something had broke it, or her had like tore a branch off, or you had some rotten wood. And whenever that happens, and these things tend to break from weather, that's the weak side. The strong side, and this comes from, I say this because years ago I did a lot of tree work when I was a young teenager. We called it the strong side, is where the fibers are still strong. As this thing starts to fall from even snow load, it will pull that around and twist. We would do that when we would fell trees. We would do that by cutting a certain side, and the fibers would cause that tree to turn or pull. That happens naturally as well when you have a snow load. First thing you want to look at when you find a tree break, look up. If there's nothing above that to cover it from the weather, most likely it's going to be snow load or something like that, because there's just no cover for it, and it's usually a smaller tree. So I have a hard time with tree breaks and things like that. Structures, I have found certain structures, but I also know a lot of people who do bushcrafting. I know a lot of Boy Scout people that do that stuff. And a lot of the structures that you see people talk about, what are they for? Because they're definitely not big enough for something to stay in. And I think if they do make them, the ones that I've seen or people have showed me, if they are, there's some kind of marker. There's something to say, hey, it's some kind of a communication device between the Bigfoot that are there, I guess. But anybody got questions? What else Bob wants to talk about?
I got a question.
Yeah.
Good. When you were seeing them shadows as a kid, was your room get cold?
I don't remember.
I don't remember.
No, it's been. I don't remember. I don't remember. I just remember the shadows. Yeah, that never.
I had experience at my mom's house, and the room would get cold, and I seen things. Even grabbed me a couple times, woke me up.
I know you can't really probably answer this, but how big of a population do you think the Bigfoot community has?
I don't think they're as big as what some people. There are some researchers out there that believe that in the United States alone there's between 50 and 60,000. I don't think that's even close. I think, I put it away. I think it's way too high, because you kind of deduce through process of elimination. You'll figure out there can't be that many, because one thing is there would be sightings continuously. Two, there's environments that just not conducive for a creature like that. So I'm more in with Grover Krantz. He thinks anywhere from 4,000 to 6,000 would be a population that would continue to be able to sustain itself across the United States. I don't think there's 50, 60,000.
Probably mean they're probably highly migratory.
Yeah. I mean, first 50, 60,000. You look, lower 48 states. You divide that just in these states, you're looking at over 1,000 per state, and just the population density of people, I don't think that would allow that.
Would you relate the story about when you were up with, what the heck was his name, Daniel Boone?
Daniel Boone?
And he was the next day you went down and heard something over the hillside, found a handprint on your car.
A friend of mine, and he's a go-to guy for Randolph County, West Virginia. Outside, anybody know where Elkins, Beverly, and stuff like that is? Well, it's kind of a rural area. Once you get outside of Elkins, it's woods. It's steep. It's woods. There's caves. Everything. Well, I got to know him, and we would do a lot of things together in that area. And he said, "Hey, I want to take you to an area called Pickle Knob." He said, there's been some sightings up there. He said, you do a lot of vocals and stuff like that. I'm like, yeah, okay. So we went to the very top of Bickel Knob, and I at the time had a town and country van that I had set up. I had a bed and everything. I had a kitchen in the back of it. That's what I took. That's my Bigfoot buggy. You know, I took it everywhere. I stayed in it. So we're on top of this knob, and the first thing I did was, you know, before it got dark, is I took a rake and I went around and I raked the leaves back, and I made what I put, you know, what I was calling foot traps, or print traps. And it was because people were, there were stories up where these things would come up to the campers and tents and stuff. So I would scrape back the leaves, and then you get that real soft decaying material underneath of it, and if anything stepped in it, it's going to leave a print. Well, I did that. Me and Daniel sat around for a while, never really heard anything. He said, well, I'm going to go home, because he just lived like a few miles down the road. He went home, I stayed in my van. I got up the next day, nothing happened, nothing during the night. Checked the footprint or print traps, nothing was there. I decided I'm going to go down to another area just down the road where he told me about, and it was called Otter Creek. And right before Otter Creek, there's this road that goes up, Old Forestry Road. I pulled in there, and I'm making, you know, recording, making a little video, and I hear this knocking noise, and it sounds, when you listen to the video, it sounds like a woodpecker. It could be a woodpecker, but to me, when I'm there, it didn't. It just sounded weird, and it had a cadence to it, and I didn't hear this anybody else say this till a couple years later. It sounded like somebody doing Morse code, and then I've heard this in other cases now, and I'm like, that's just weird. I mean, that's just odd. But I'm gonna go check it out. So I went and I got my backpack, had put my gun on me, started up the mountain, hiked up the mountain. Any soft spot I could find, I'd check out. Never found any footprints, anything like that. But I get going about 3/4 of the way up the mountain, and I hear something in the woods. But the thing is, and this is where, you know, Fred and I've had discussions, because, you know, Fred's more into the interdimensional stuff, and I'm not saying it's not a possibility, but but I hear something moving, but I can't see it. So I pass off a squirrel or something, you know, maybe, because I can look 50, 60 feet back in the trees. There's nothing there. Goes around, moves goes down toward my, in the direction where my van is. I go all the way to the top of the ridge, I hike the top around the ridge, come back down, and I go to get in the back of my van, because it was just a push button. I walk back here, have my backpack, and I go to look. There's handprints, big handprints one's on the top of the van, one's down on the window, like where the windshield wiper part is. There's a handprint there, one up here, and then right below that looks like where this part of your arm would be, and then right here probably is what I'm assuming, like the belly area. It looked like something had leaned in on my van and left handprints and hair smudge marks, muddy marks on my van. To this day, I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was a Bigfoot. Either way, it's kind of unsettling. If it was a Bigfoot creature or some weirdo out there, you know, following me around the woods and looking in my van. But the dust on the back of my van and whatever it was wet, because it smeared. It looked like mud, and left the handprints on the van.
Now look at me, I believe you. I've seen the video.
Yeah.
And Les has, how many videos you got on?
Like about 100 something.
Yeah, I mean, they're very interesting. And he takes his boys out
Yeah.
a good bit.
Well, some people say they're interesting. I mean, I don't do no fluff in them. I go out and record. I walk. I don't do no special editing stuff, except, you know, make them do, you know, if I stop the camera or something like that, then, you know, join together. That's about it. But there's no funky, fancy, weird stuff on them. But the only thing I've really experienced, other than the handprints, is I've heard the howl. People call it the Ohio howl, something similar to that, a couple times. The one time I heard that, it was outside of Davis, West Virginia, an area. I don't know, anybody know where Blackwater Falls is at?
Yeah.
Between, you know, is anybody familiar with the Canaan Loop area? Well, it was on the Canaan Loop. In January 2020, I think it was, I was on the Canadian Loop, and that's where I found my first print, was in 2020. So that's a place I go back to quite a bit. Well, this time I went in, I was by myself for a day, I was camping. Daniel said he was gonna come in the next day. He shows up, we're hanging out, and my son and his friend were coming later that afternoon. Well, on the way in, my son, he's seen these pieces of firewood, or it wasn't really firewood, but it was pieces of an old pine tree that someone had cut up along the road. They had a cabin at the end of the road, and they cut this, it fell, and they cut it up and stacked it and said free firewood. So he decided to pick it up. He brought it in, brought a bunch of it to the camp. And anybody's ever tried to split pine, old pine, it don't split great. Even though it's a softwood, it don't split great. And then he had an axe, probably wouldn't split butter if he really wanted to. So he come in and he beat on that wood and he beat on that wood, probably for 2 hours. And he finally got it all split, and we're just hanging out around the fire. Sitting there, and all of a sudden, probably 10 minutes after he's done, we heard this howl like I've never heard in my life. Come from across the, like there was a pine, where we was at, then there's a pine forest, and up there they have what they call blister swamps or peat swamps. There's peat moss that thick that you walk through. And then the water up there is, the reason they call it Blackwater Falls, Blackwater Canyon, is the water's all brown. The tannins from all that peat turns the water brown. And so there was that, a creek, a small creek, more of the peat, and then the hardwood forest. And we heard that howl come from over toward that hardwood forest. We all jumped up, and again, I tell people, when you go in, if you're going in to do this stuff, make sure you turn something on all the time, because you never know when it's going to happen. We didn't have the recorders running or anything. We were just hanging out. We was BSing, and that we heard it, but we didn't have a recorder to catch it. And all of a sudden, my buddy Daniel jumps up, and he's running out in the road, or out in the woods, and he's got his parabolic mic, hoping to hear it again. We never did, but we never heard it. The next day, we get up, Daniel has to go home, and I told my son, I was like, I want to go over where we heard that howl. He said, all right, we'll get ready. I said, no, you stay here, because his buddy Isaiah was not a camper, was not whatever. He's like, he's already freaking out because he heard the sound. I said, you stay here, that way if something happens, you where you're at, there's phone service. But with GPS, he was able to follow me, and I said, just follow me on GPS. And he did, and I said, if anything happens, we always said, we'll shoot 3 times, something's wrong, I'm in trouble. So he stays at camp. I hike across the pine forest, across both marshes, get in the hardwood, get over in that area. And I'm looking around, and I walk up and find this rock stack that stands about this tall. And it's not little rocks either, like you see the people put along the creek and stuff. We're talking rocks this big. The base rock is about like that. So the top one, that person's going to handle. But why would they do it? Why would they carry it across a marsh or anything to build this? But the bottom rock was probably that big and that thick. You're looking at probably 300, 400 pounds. Found that, thought that was interesting. And then I walked on to my right, and there's some boulders there inside these trees, and I see another rock that's about the size of a soccer ball. And this rock has been picked up by, in what I can think it has, it looks like, and bashed on top of this boulder. And it's kind of shattered around. So I took pictures that documented all that, and I made sure I tagged how to get through to get into them, and went back and told my son about it. 2 years later, 2 or 3 years, I'm trying to remember, 2 years later, almost 3, got contacted about wanting to do some filming, and Alex Petticoff from Small Town Monsters and stuff came up, and they wanted me to take them and show them that. We tried to do it at nighttime. It was so thick, I couldn't find the markers that I put, little tape and little pens. We couldn't find it, so the next day we got up and went during the daytime. We ended up finding it, found the rock stack still the same way it was 2 or 3 years earlier. But the only other thing we found is around where that was at, we found these trees. Something like a bear would climb trees, they scrape and they pull it down. This was pulled up. Something had like dug into it and pulled the bark up. And we found like 2 or 3 of those, and we just thought those and just documented those. But yeah, that's kind of some cool stuff that I've dealt with. But one of the most compelling, I'll just tell you one of the most compelling stories I've ever heard, encountered of. There's been 2. The first one was this guy, he gets a hold of me, he goes, hey, he said, I just want to let you know, he said, I seen something I can't, and he said, that I can't explain at the moment. He said, but I can tell you it wasn't a bear. I was like, okay. So he went on, he goes, then he gets more comfortable and he goes, I'm 63 years old. He said, I'm basically a mountain man. He said, I've hunted, I've fished these hills all my life. He said, nobody in this world could tell me Bigfoot exists in the world, let alone West Virginia. He said, but what I saw, me and my wife saw, he said, now you can't tell me it doesn't. I'm like, okay, well, tell me more about it. He goes, well, he said, we was driving down, I think it's Route 39, it's right outside of Drendon, West Virginia. He said, we see there's a gravel lot. And I went to the location, I talked to him there. And the gravel lot, he said, we see something coming out on all 4s. He said, I thought it was a bear at first. We start to slow down, we get closer. It comes out in the middle of their lane, and it stands up straight on 2 legs and turns and faces him. He said, at that moment, we knew it wasn't a bear. He said, I didn't know what to think. He said, this thing ain't supposed to exist. He said, but I'm looking at it. And I said, well, describe it for me. He would go through it, him and his wife both would describe it. They tell me the same thing. But there was one particular part they tell me that got me so intrigued that I had to go talk to them. And I had to go see it. And I had to be, because they kept telling me, we don't remember seeing the feet. They would describe how wide this thing was, how tall it was, how it had very little hair here, how his face looked. But then they say, we don't remember seeing his feet. And I just thought that was weird. It was very intriguing to me. So I went, I talked to him, and when I have more than one witnesses like that, I will separate and interview separately. Because what you don't want to happen is you don't want one witness to feed off the other witness, and their perspectives will become skewed. Because even though both of them were in that car, they both were in a different, I guess, angle. Everybody's perspective is going to be different. You're not always looking at the same spot the other person is, so you're going to get different stories. So I looked at the lady, and she said, I don't even want to get out of the car. I said, that's fine. I said, do you mind sketching what you saw? And she said, absolutely. She said, I can do that. And she does. I leave her in the car, and me and my son take the gentleman. We're walking around. He's showing us the stuff. And I was like, I looked at him. I was like, I carry these pictures. They're 4x4 pictures of CGI renderings of faces that people have supposedly seen over the years. And what I do is usually use them as like a lineup in a way. Have people pick a face they've seen, or different features from different faces. But also use it as also use it as a bullshit tale, really. And people will say, what do you mean by that? I was like, well, if you take these pictures and you lay them out one by one, and you look at that picture, and you're like, yeah, that's it. You're probably telling me it fit, because you didn't have a reaction. You're going to have a reaction when you're going to trigger something when you see something you don't understand. Well, he picked it out, and he had that trigger. I could tell. So he picked his face out, and I went back, and the lady gave me the paper. And to me, when you look at the picture and look at her sketching, the faces look very familiar. She's got the same turned down mouth, wide nose, everything. But in her picture, she only drew down to about the knees. She stopped at the bottom of the paper. And I just thought that was the oddest thing. So I'm standing there talking to the gentleman, and then it hits me. I said, can you take my son and stand him where this thing was at in the road? I said, don't put him in the road, but stand him next to the road. And my he's a big fella. He's like 6'1", like at the time probably 290 to 300 pounds, somewhere there. 6'2", somewhere there. So he stands, puts him right there. I said, now I'm going to pull down through here. You stop me in my car where you were at. And he does. So I take my picture, or my phone, hold it eye level, and I take a picture. Get out of the car, walk over to him, hand him my phone. I said, what? And I showed him the picture, and you can see his face just go white. And I was like, what do you notice? He said, you can't see his feet. You can't see my son's leg, or from the kneecap, or from below the knees down. You can't see it. And the reason is, they were that close. The hood actually blocks, any of that from the sight. So that puts whatever they've seen within 8 feet of the front of the car. So how's a man that's 63 years old, supposedly hunted all his life, lived in West Virginia all his life, calls himself a mountain man, mistakes something that's 8 feet away for a bear for anything like that? So to me, it's one of the most compelling stories that I've ever, in reports I've ever taken. The other one would be Billy Humphreys. If you guys follow Finding Bigfoot, if you follow Expedition Bigfoot, I think it was, he was on both of those because of his story. But I was the first one, way before Bobo, way before Cliff, or any of them was even on this guy's property. I was the first one on his property. And I interviewed him several times. And what the story goes, him and his wife were putting food out. She had shot a bear like earlier. It was either earlier that spring or whenever, or the year before. I can't remember exactly which one it was. She had shot a bear, but they had a blind up on this hill, and they were putting food out. They would put different food out from the house, or he'd go buy corn, or he'd go buy like old watermelons and stuff, peanut butter, whatever. He'd put it up there for try to get bears to come in or other animals. He started noticing that the food was coming up missing really fast, extremely fast. So he told his wife, he says, "There's got to be a bear. There's got to be another bear." So they go up, or he goes up, has some food out, and he took his solar-powered motion light, and he had his blind, and he put this solar-powered light right behind the blind, up as high as he could reach, was probably about 7 foot, because he was 6'1", so he could reach up comfortably about 7. So he's sitting in the blind one night, and the light kicks on. He's thinking, oh, it's just got to be deer or something. Kicked it on, but he don't see anything. Even because and if you talk to this guy, he'll tell you, I didn't believe in any of that stuff. He said, I don't believe in Bigfoot. It never even crossed my mind. And he'll tell you, he's a Marine veteran and stuff like that, But anyway, he said, the light kicks on. He said, I didn't really think much about it. He said, even when, he said, it didn't until later he thought about it, but even when something actually blocked the light out from coming into the back of his blind, which would have been over 7 foot tall. But he never thought about it. Then he got the weird feeling. He said, I got a feeling that I was uncomfortable. So he started texting his wife. He said, something weird's going on. He said, it just feels uncomfortable up here. So he eventually goes back home. A few days later, it was in October of 19. I don't remember the exact date, but it was October 19 of 2019. Him and his wife both are in the blind. And they're sitting there, and he's fiddling with different deer calls, and he's blind. So he's got a board across here, and he's like putting them where he wanted them. And she goes, oh my God, there he is. And he goes, what, the bear? And he's just like looking down. And she goes, no, it's Bigfoot. And he's like, oh, you're full of shit. And then he looks up and he sees it. And then and this thing is 160 feet away once I did all the measurements. And he had an old junky phone. He pulls his phone up and he takes a picture, like through the opening of the blind. Well, that picture got a whole bunch of attention. That's why they got him on Find Bigfoot and everything. But I've talked to Billy several times. His story's never changed. And I went back a few times and talked to him, tried to get him to change, see if it would change, and his wife to change. So, but then there's one time I'm sitting there talking to him, and after we become a little bit of friends, and I was like, because he's always like, yeah, I was a Marine veteran, I'm not afraid of anything, but I was terrified that day. I said, well, when you seen that thing, what did you do? He said, I ran home. He said, I out and ran home. I said, what about Sheena? He said, I don't know, I left her in the blind. But anyway, I just started talking to him, got to be friends with him. And I think it was the third time I was there. He had to go check on something at the chicken coop. But I'd always tell when they were together that Sheena was uncomfortable about something. and she had something else she wanted to share. And he left and went to check him. I said, I could tell that there's something you don't want to say around him. I was like, you can tell me. I said, if you're comfortable with, tell me. She goes, okay. She goes, the year before we seen this thing, she goes, I was out hanging clothes. She goes, I was out, it was a nice day. She goes, I washed the linens. She goes, I had all the linens stretched out on the clothesline. She goes, I put them out, nice breezy day. She had put them out on the clothesline. She goes, I went in, after ample time, she goes, I went back out. They should have been dry. She goes, I go out and I start taking down. I got the basket, started taking down. She goes, I looked down the other end of the clothesline, the other T-post, and she says, at first, in my mind, there's a pair of coveralls hanging over the T-post. Had its arms of it up like that. And she goes, then I realized, because I didn't wash any kind of coveralls. And then she goes, as I'm staring, that's when it moved. She goes, it moved, his arms moved. And she goes, I screamed, dropped the basket, and this thing took off running, like the other one did, down through the woods. But this one went across the 4-foot fence, stepped across it, and moved down through the woods. And she never did tell Billy that until after that day. And he's like, why the hell didn't you tell me? She goes, you wouldn't have believed me anyway. So, but it's his story. A lot of people are like, just when they see the picture and stuff. Absolutely, it's there, and some people know we don't see it. I can see it, and I can see what the features he describes. One of the main features he describes in this thing when they saw it is below the eyes there was blonde, like blondish white hair. He said it was kind of lighter color below its eyes. And you can see that in this picture. You can see the discoloration in the form. So 2 years after I did the investigation, a guy calls me just out of the blue. He said, "Hey," he said, "I found you online." He said, "I don't believe in this stuff." He said, "But what I saw, I can't explain." He said, "I started looking." He said, "I found your name under Bigfoot." He said, "I just thought, hey, I'll call him." He calls me and he tells me this story. He goes, "Taking my kids to school." He said, "We're driving along. It was like Route 61, I think this." And he asked me, he goes, "You know what kudzu vine is?" And most of you probably know what kudzu vine is, right? It's like this vine, it overtakes everything. It'll smother out trees. It covers everything.
It grows like a foot a day.
Oh, it's got leaves like this big around. He said, "I'm driving along." He said, "There's kudzu vine on the right side of the road." He said, "That's when I see his hands come out, pull the kudzu vine back, and his head this thing stick his head out through the kudzu vine." And he describes what he's seen and everything. I said, "Can you sketch me a picture?" And he did, and he did it in color. He did it with colored pencils. And he sent it to me. And right then when I seen that, I asked him, I said, "Have you ever heard of Billy Humphreys?" He said, "No, I have no idea who that is." I said, "Do you know about the Denise, West Virginia sighting?" He said, "No." He said, "I don't follow this stuff." He said, "I told you I don't believe in it." He didn't believe in it. And I was like, and I told him, I said, "How far are you away from Denise?" And he told me. And in, I guess, the grander scale of things, it's not that far for one of these things to travel. I don't think it was the same thing, but I think this trait that he sketched, which was the blonde under his eyes, had to do with something with maybe a family unit in that area. Because the one Billy supposedly seen was huge. Had a big, massive, or not massive, I can't say big, massive, basically had no neck. It was so big up here, the typical side thing you hear. This guy said no, it was kind of smaller. He said more orangish color. Billy said it was more dark brown and black. So is this a trait that these things might have, like in a family unit in that area? But I thought it was really cool when he told me that and showed me the picture, because not only did it validate Billy's sighting, he was able to be validated from his sighting, because Billy's sighting matches things he saw. I thought it was pretty cool. Anything else?
You're doing good.
Oh, Fred mentioned the UFOs, and I am in all kind of stuff. Bigfoot's not the only thing I look in. Sometimes I get bored with Bigfoot. One of my favorite things is looking into giants and stuff like that. But here, a few months ago, this lady contacts me and says, "Hey, I live outside of Point Pleasant. I live in Mason County, and I'm seeing strange lights, and we've seen these things for over a year. So I'm thinking, okay, you hear about will-o'-the-wisp, spook lights and stuff like that. I'm thinking it might be associated with the property. And again, I'm thinking it might just be nothing, because I went and done these investigations and nothing will happen. So I'm at their property talking to them, and their kids were telling me stuff, and there's more to the lights and stuff, and other things are happening on the property that make me think that it might be maybe UFO related, but at the time. And she's telling me you can see these lights over on the hillside or come across above the trees. So we go out, we're sitting there, I'm sitting there by myself, and they had a big field, and they're in a house, and I messaged her. I said, I think I might have seen one, but I couldn't tell for sure, it was like a faint light. And she comes out, she goes, that's pretty early. I said, what do you mean it's pretty early? She goes, they happen usually religiously from 9:30, 10 o'clock to almost midnight this time of year. And she's kept basically a journal, right, of when the year changed, the seasons changed, these lights changed. And I'm sitting there, and at 10 o'clock, it happens. I see these lights, bright ones, up out of the trees. And they're white, and they're orange, and they're moving around. And I got them on film. I don't know if I can show you my phone or not, but I've caught them on film. And I'm thinking, oh my God, I've never seen anything like this. And after I put one of the, I didn't put the videos out because they didn't want nobody to know. And I told them I wouldn't. Well, eventually she decided to put something out about it. So then she said, yeah, I don't mind if you share them. We want to know if anybody else is experiencing this. And when I did that, people from Pennsylvania, Ohio, Maryland, West Virginia, all in that area started sending me messages. We see these lights too. So I'm thinking, well, that can't be, only that property. It's got to be something else going on. So I went to different locations. I would go to different areas around the states to see if I could see them. And they always happen in the western sky. So I don't know what these things are, but if you go out in the western sky, usually this time of year they start about 7:30, 8 o'clock when the sun goes below the horizon. You will see these lights moving around. What I think people are experiencing are what they call, I can't remember what the acronym means, but they're low-flying satellites, low-orbit satellites. But they buzz around in different directions. And then here, 2 months ago, I was in Mon County, West Virginia, outside of Moretown, sitting up on Cheat Lake. Everybody knows where Cheat Lake is, probably. Not Cheat Lake, sorry. Cooper's Rocks.
Yeah.
I mean, anybody know right at the top where the truck place is, and you have the state road place right there, sitting right there, looking at the western sky, and me and my friend Tammy, we see these lights, and they're not like what you see the Starlink, a bunch of lights in a string. These are one, and they just kept moving, and then after a while, those quit, and I was able to put my camera on time lapse, and you'd see them just buzzing, just zipping around. So
It would change direction.
Oh yeah. I don't know. So I don't know what they are. I mean, the only thing I can find.
Satellite.
Well, it's not the typical satellite. There are what they call. There's an acronym for it, but they're low orbit satellites, and I think that what the people are seeing is those. And when the sun gets down lower, they reflect, because once that sun goes well below the horizon at a certain time, they're gone. But it's always in the west. I don't know why it's only in the western sky though. I mean, other than the sun. I haven't got the chance to watch the eastern sky when the sun comes up, see if we see them. But that's the only explanation I got for them at the moment. I don't think there's something other than a couple of them that seem weird. There have been ones that come across the horizon. They seem to come up and stuff, but I've seen them going across. And usually a bright light. Other than those, I think there are more satellites, but still unidentified. I don't really know for sure.
But your eyes could play tricks on you too. I work up by the airport.
You ain't playing no tricks on me, buddy. I got them on video. You can watch
I know,
them.
but
Yeah.
the other night I had to go in and
Yeah.
work real late, sitting at the plant.
Yeah.
We're like 3-4 miles from the airport.
Yeah.
Well, you can hear them.
Oh yeah.
Well, I'm sitting there, I'm just kind of gazing. There's nobody around. I'm waiting on him with a whitish blue light. Right off the bat, oh shit, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I bet I watched that thing for 15 minutes. Pretty soon, as it didn't look like it was getting closer, but then you could see it start to flash.
Yeah.
Then it moved a little.
Well, the ones I would see in Mason County, you could tell the direction they're coming. They're coming across the horizon. At first, the first time I was there, they looked like they'd come up out of the trees.
Right.
And they went from northwest to due west over a 2-month period. And they went from looking like it's coming up out of the trees to coming straight at you or going off this way. But you could definitely tell when the ones are coming at you, because they were dim, then they get really bright, and then eventually they go away. Then you would see them come off. I have seen the ones in Mason County where the weirdest one was one comes up and there's a plane going across. You can see the flashing of the plane. One of these lights is like kind of below, way below. It looks like it's tailing the plane below. And then one comes up from the horizon and meets them and moves across. That's not normal.
What I saw was a plane once
Yeah.
it got, but for 15 minutes, it was like where you was at. It was like it never moved.
Yeah. But yeah, these, I can show you a couple of videos.
But it must have been just the angle that I was
Oh, yeah.
sitting on the parking lot, because like I said, it was 15 minutes. It never moved. I was like, oh shit, yeah, and, you know.
There's been a few times I thought some of them were planes, but they don't have the blinking.
We got the same thing going on right now in Tyler County.
Yeah. I've got one video where at the end where I'm recording in Mon County, where I thought it was 2 planes coming, and I'm like, I told my friend Tammy, I was like, those planes look like they're going to hit. And what's the chance of 2 planes coming at nighttime, right to the same spot, and then get really bright, and then move back off the other? To me, it's just weird. I don't know. To me, unexplainable. But yeah, I thought that was some of the cool stuff I've seen here recently.
And you said about 1,000 Bigfoots. I work the oil field, so I'm stuck all through West Virginia,
Yeah.
New York, upstate or lower New York, upstate PA. There's a lot of territory.
Yeah.
So I would buy 1,000 on an average per state. Because
But you
you're
gotta
talking
realize,
a lot
but-
of territory.
Again, there may be a lot of territory, but if you take 1,000, there's a gentleman called William Jennings, and he believes that what they do is they don't stay together. The only time this family clans will come together is during maybe mating season, or they would completely eradicate the food source. Because you got to look. If these things, which I don't believe, I don't think they all are, what people say 8, 10 feet tall, 8, 9, 10 feet tall. I don't believe so. I don't believe that at all. One is because something that big, the amount of food source it would have to have, and if there's a clan of them, a family unit, which people are talking about 10, that would decimate.
Yeah, it's a lot of food.
Yeah, a lot. So I don't believe they are. And if you look into the psychiatric part of it, whenever your brain has an issue or is stunned, I guess you say, when you see something like this, your perspective is skewed, I guess, or it's usually somewhere between 10-15% causing something to look bigger. So if you look at something that's like 6 foot tall, at 10-15%, it's going to put it, in that probably that range. But I don't think they're all that big.
Yeah, because that buck you shoot's always bigger before you walk out.
Oh yeah,
yeah.
So I that's another reason. Now I also don't believe, like a lot of people, especially a lot of BFRO people, because Matt Moneymaker has told them that deer is their main food source. I don't believe that either. If you have a group that big, that would decimate the deer population. It would take a lot of them. I mean, they would in a general area, not in probably a whole state.
Now, what is that? Pennsylvania Bigfoot. They're on Facebook. There was a guy on there, or somebody on there, come on and ask, you believe that they migrate in the winter head a little more south to get out of the cold? Because that was like a topic on it. Was that?
And again,
Okay, well, I lived in Florida for 20 years. I never
They say they might migrate.
and again, when it comes to that discussion, if they do that, then the population in these states is going to, boom. So there should be more sightings. So,
Or even like a hibernation. Do you get more sightings in the nicer weather or the colder weather? You know what I mean?
usually most sightings tend to be probably in the spring and fall, not really in the
Some
cold.
people have a food theory.
They move with the food.
In the wintertime, you can't find much.
I've been looking into different food sources. You know, like I said, a lot of these researchers say deer's the main source. I don't think that's true. I think they're more like a bear. I think, because if you look at the bear, which could be the explanation for some of the sightings because of bear.
Right.
If you look at bear population and Bigfoot sightings, they kind of go hand in hand. And I think that's because of the food sources. And I think they eat like bear. I think they're an omnivore. I think they eat berries, they eat other stuff. And I think one of their main food sources, if you look in a lot of these places, they're near water. I think a lot of the reason for that is because I think one of their main food sources is fish. Not only just I think that, I also think they are more into insects and stuff. Because I started looking into caloric intake. And if you look into that and protein and stuff like that, you do your research and tests have done, pound for pound, certain insects and grubs and stuff hold more calories and protein than what beef does, and venison. So I don't know, why wouldn't they? If these things are that big and these scientists say they need anywhere from 8,000 to 10,000 calories a day to survive and have the brain functions supposedly they're supposed to have, I think they're going to be something more in the lines of that. But I mean, like I tell you, me and Fred's talk, everything we talk about, even the people that are supposedly experts, is all based on theories. It's hypotheses. We don't have any of them to sit and examine or watch and research. And so that's why I don't like to be called research really. I like to look into the subject, talk to people, and then look into certain things. So I don't have one that I can sit and research all the time, or a group.
But there is kind of a mathematical calculation to it, because you figure something that's say like 7 feet tall, maybe it weighs 500 pounds. It's going to take X number of calories to keep it going.
Right.
So if it don't have that all the time, it's just going to starve to death eventually.
Yeah, and the whatever scientists you want to call them, the biologists, whatever, will tell you that it doesn't necessarily have to do with the size. The caloric intake is what people talk about, how these things exhibit different some intelligence level. That takes brain power or brain size, and that takes more calorie, caloric intake to have that intelligence. So I don't think I don't think they're just lumbering around killing a deer here every once in a while. I think they eat a bunch of different stuff.
Have you ever heard of anybody seeing a Bigfoot eating deer?
See what?
Seeing a Bigfoot eating a deer?
Yeah. Well, yeah, maybe. Because I don't know if it was a Bigfoot. This is, I'm going to try to get through this one real quick. Kind of the weirdest story I've ever heard. 1990, it was early 90s, I can't remember exactly year. This guy and his friend were in the Dolly Sods area. They were backpacking. And there's been encounters come out of Dolly Sods, but there's also been other stuff come out of Dolly Sods. There's been UFO sightings and all kind of weird stuff coming out of Dolly Sods. But they were backpacking. They were they decided to stay in this one area along a gas line right away. And there's an area called I can't remember. I know it. Anyway, they wanted to go to this area. It had a bunch of big rock overhangs and stuff. But his buddy, and I told you guys about how the water is brown. In that area is brown too. His buddy was drinking the water, and he didn't boil the water. He didn't do any filtered water, and he drank the water. So his buddy gets sick, and he said he's real sick. He said the dude's gone from both ends, So they wanted to go to this area. His buddy's like, I can't go. He said, well, I'm still going. He goes on to the area, comes back, and he gets on the right of way, and he starts to walk down toward the tent, the area where the tent was at. and he hears his buddies like, hey, hey. He looks over, he's laying off the side of the right of way down near a little creek, thinking he's sick, something wrong, he's sick. He said, man, what's wrong? He's like motioning, he said, get down here.
Law.
He gets down there, he said, are you okay? He said, yeah. He said, but did you see that?
Law.
He said, I looked down toward my tent, and he said, what I see coming out of the tent are two big hairy legs backing out of the tent. He said, this thing stands up, looks, looking around. He said, I never thought anything about a Bigfoot-like creature. He said, when I seen this thing, he said, to me, it looked like a great big hairy naked man. And that's what he kept calling it, hairy naked man. So he takes off running, thinking somebody's trying to steal their stuff. He runs toward it, and this thing crashes down through the laurel and stuff and takes off through the woods. Well, later, his buddy's like, well, I want to get out of here. I don't want to be here. He's like, no. He said, man, we're not hiking out here. It's getting dark. We're not going to hike out here right now. He said, we'll be all right. He says, probably just some crazy moonshine dude, So later that night, they get the fire going, and his buddy's like freaking out. They finally go to sleep. Sometime during the middle of the night, his buddy wakes him up. He said, man, that thing's back outside. And he looks, and you can see the silhouette of this thing on the tent, between the fire and the tent. So he goes to unzip the tent real quick to yell, thinking it's, again, some weirdo out there messing with him. But he said, and he kept telling me, to him it's a big, hairy, naked man. This thing takes off running again through the woods. They get up next morning. His buddy's adamant about wanting to leave. He's like, no. He said, well, we're getting ready. He said, I got to have something, man. He said, I got to eat. He said, well, you seen that thing? He said, dude, it's just some weirdo. He said, just some weirdo out there, hanging out. So they go over, he starts to make food, making bacon and eggs or something like that. And he said he looks up, and this thing is standing over next to the wood line. And he looks at it, and he gets up, and he goes to confront it again. He walks toward it, and goes over and says something like, hey, you, or whatever, and this thing tries to mimic him. And then he gets closer, and he reaches out, and this thing reaches out, and he grabs his arm. And then he looks at it, and he realizes this thing's not what he thought at first. It's just something else. It turns and goes back in the woods, and he goes back over toward the fire. Before they get packed up, this thing comes out of the wood with a small deer, like a baby deer, on its shoulder. Comes over, slams it down on the ground by the fire, rips the front leg off of it, and starts to eat the deer leg raw, is what he tells me. He said, then I realized that this is, this is messed up. He said, we're out of here. And the thing eventually takes off again. But again, like I was telling Fred, I had somebody tell me a story about eating deer. I don't know if it was a Bigfoot, but this guy says it was probably 7 foot tall. And he described it, because he was an anthropologist, and he asked me, he said, you know what Denisovian is? I was like, yeah, it's an ancient man, kind of bigger, caveman type. He said, that's what it looks like. So, is that a Bigfoot creature? Is it something from a relic hominid, like an ancient man? Or, you hear stories in West Virginia, or even all over Appalachia, of the feral people. Was this just a feral person? But to him, it was just, he kept saying it was just a big, naked, hairy man. But, I guess this big, naked, hairy man had enough strength to rip his leg off a deer and try to start to eat it. So, yeah.
That's the only story I've ever heard. But then again, like I say, Bigfoot, okay, he's supposed to be hominid, right? He's supposed to be a little bit like us. So he's going to eat the deer's leg with the hair on. That's what I don't understand there. If he is supposed to be like us so much, how's he going to, what you do with the hair?
I
haven't seen him cooking it.
I've heard other ones where they've had small dogs or a rabbit or something in their hand. The one with the rabbit was down around, actually not too far from where Billy Humphreys had his sighting. This was well before Billy. The woman was driving home. This was a second-hand story that her daughter was telling me. The woman was driving home from work. It's right outside the little area called Lookout, West Virginia, which I've taken several reports now from that area. She's driving out this little road. There's a big rock there. She looks up and sees something. With the headlights hit it, sees something on the rock. She thought it was like, something, maybe a bear sitting there. And then it stood up, faced the car, and she was able to see it in the broad, or with the illuminated with the headlights. This thing, wasn't a bear, and it had what she believed was a rabbit or something in his hand, and it looked like it had been eating the rabbit.
Any other questions for Les? Comments?
I got a question,
Yeah.
but it's something I want to tell you about first. You're familiar with the layout of the McDonald's in downtown Point Pleasant, West Virginia, right? The counter with the checkout registers there, and behind there's a shelf, and they get this big coffee maker, metal coffee maker. Okay, this was Saturday morning last year of the Mothman Festival, like 8:30 in the morning. The place is packed.
Yeah.
I'm standing there at the counter. I could go into more detail, but I'm trying to keep it short. Standing there at the counter, the woman is there checking me out there, and on this shelf behind her, nobody was anywhere near, just this metal, like bowl-shaped like canister that I guess it's where the coffee maker fits up, or the filter fits up in there. This thing propelled itself off of the counter. I mean, it landed like 3 feet away from the counter, and nobody was near it.
Yeah.
That's pretty weird. But you want to say something?
That's pretty wild. Yeah.
But the other thing I wanted to ask you about was, I've heard of reports of giants out in like Alberta and Manitoba and Montana and stuff. Have you ever heard of any reports like east of the Mississippi River, whether in Canada or the United States?
What, you mean historical reports?
Any
Oh, yeah.
historical?
Yeah, Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, all of them is steep with giants. I mean, because you've had.
I mean, we're
Some
talking
people
about the
believe-
red-haired giants, right?
Oh.
Yeah, is that
well-
what you mean? 'Cause I'm kind of distinguishing between the red-haired giants and the ones that they claim that they see that have tusks coming out from their lower jaw.
I mean, I know the red-haired giants are something that's a Native American lore. I mean, they called them, basically squaw stealers and stuff. They would take the squaws and kids and supposedly ate them. And there was actually, supposedly in Native American lore, there were 2 giants. There were the redhead giants, which were the cannibals. They called them cannibals. And then there was the other ones that more or less was like a brown, dark hair, whatever. That was what they called the fourth brother. Now, was that Bigfoot? I don't know. And then maybe this giant was these redhead giants were a different species or race. I don't know. But it's in a lot of Native American lore. The only time you'll hear if you read some of these old newspaper articles, they were talking about finding these skeletons where they have remains of red hair. But that might be related to some of these giants that are found, because the size can be misjudged because they're not together the way they should have been, when they were laid back out. So a 6-foot person could have been being 6 to 8, 7 foot, because they weren't laid out properly. So were some of these giants a Native American race that was here and was eradicated, which you hear about. Again, you'll hear about lore where these giants were pushed, and supposedly the Mayans actually inhabited a lot of the southwestern United States and were pushed south because of these giants. But then there's a time when they retaliated in Lovelock Cave where they actually corralled them into a cave and burnt the cave and killed a bunch of them. The only time the one in West Virginia is in Reesville, West Virginia. There was 3 of them found.
Reesville, no kidding. I knew somebody lived there for a while.
Yeah, supposedly 3 giants were found when they were digging a footer for a bridge across the Paw Paw Creek, and they supposedly had remnants of red hair. But they said, like many of the other ones, when they were found, within hours they started to decay. The bones turned black and started to fall apart. And the remains were examined by Dr. Zedekiah Kidwell and then supposedly reburied. And I've heard that story all my life because I just grew up just down the road from Reesville. So I started looking into that one and dug deep into it. Ended up finding where, once I found out certain things, I wanted to know were the characters in this story actual people, or was this a made-up story? So I found, Satterfield, which is supposedly was the foreman of the job, or whatever you want to call him. Zedekiah Kidwell was a doctor that supposedly examined them. I found both of them. I know they were real people. I know where they're buried. And Zedekiah was in a cemetery that had grown over for years and was left. But I found him. But there's a kicker to that story. Supposedly these giants were reburied and put this, nobody knows exactly where it is, but they're supposed to be buried in what they call the Jolliffe Cemetery. Well, Jolliffe was a kind of a prominent name in that area, along with certain other ones. And if you look into certain cemeteries, you'll find Jolliffes all over. And I found a cemetery that I think they might have been in at the time. And there's a connection between that cemetery and the doctor. Once I started looking into the doctor, and I found the cemetery, and in the area that I went and looked, well, here's what happened. I went and looked into the Giants area, or the Giant story, and supposedly there was a road called the Macadam Road, and it ended at a certain period, and it's supposedly a prehistoric, not prehistoric, but an ancient road built by these Native Americans. And I went to where it supposedly ended, and I walked up to this guy's house. He's out in his yard, and I asked him about the Giants. He's ever heard about it? And he's like, no, because I was looking for the Jolliffe Cemetery. I said, well, I looked on old maps, and this used to be Jolliffe property. And he said, it still is. He said, I'm a descendant of Jolliffe, and all the Jolliffes still live up the road. And I asked him about the cemetery. He said, no. And then I'm standing there, he said, but there is the burial mound. And I'm like, where? And I'm standing on his back porch, and there's a hill. He said, you're looking at it. And in the middle of this field is a huge mound. You can't tell it until you get an aerial view of it. When it's been put out, this is a mound. I was there many years ago, and now it's put out that it's an actual burial mound. It's called the Catawba Mound. But anyway, I'm sitting there talking to him, and I get ready to leave, and he goes, hey, he said, by the way, he said, there's no cemetery that I know of here. He said, only a hill over there across the creek, there's a cemetery. So I was like, okay, I'll go check it out. I'll drive up there, and it's a bunch of newer stones. I'm like, nah, it's probably not it. And then I looked over to the left, and I could see this huge cedar tree. And for anybody who looks into old cemeteries, for some reason, old cemeteries, they were plotted or whatever around cedar trees. You always find a huge cedar tree in an old cemetery. And I look, and so I started walking toward it. I get closer, and I can see a couple boards that are just planks for stone or for headstones. And then I started looking at the other side, reading it real careful. And then I started noticing Jolliffe. All these were Jolliffe under that cemetery or under that tree. So I'm like, well, maybe I found them. Maybe I found where they're supposed to be buried at. So I dug into the doctor a little bit more, and somebody had written a bio about him. And in that bio it says he's an upstanding member of the MP Church. And I'm like, I've seen that somewhere before, and I just couldn't remember. And after looking at it for a minute, it hit me. It's on the maps. It's on the old maps. So I pulled up the old maps that I have, and it's from 1850 something. And I'm looking at where the mound is, or supposedly the mound is, where I found the Jolliffe property. There's a church, and underneath that church it says MP Church. So, to me, if they really were discovered and reburied, examined by the doctor, I think they're probably in that cemetery because he was a member of that church and in that area. I mean, even though it's a little ways away it's a little short distance down the river from Reedsville, I think they're there. Like I said, the only thing that I have an issue with, the kicker of it is,
I have an order to put in.
There's only been a couple places that I've read where it says they were discovered in 1875. If that's the case, the whole story is just a bunk, because the doctor died in 1872. So, is it a true story? I don't know. It's a fantastical story, but it's one that I've heard on for many years. So.
There's one other thing, just real quick. A few years ago, maybe 5 years ago, this guy up in Alberta had a YouTube channel. Had nothing to do with paranormal stuff. He swore he saw something up on a mountain. He took videos of it. You know what I'm talking about? What do you think about that story here? Do you think there's anything to it? Just a bunch of
some people
clickbait.
Well, no, it's an actual video. An actual video. Finding Bigfoot actually looked at that video. They, of course, they're like, "Oh, yeah, it's Bigfoot." There was other people who come forward later. There was some campers that were down below.
Yeah.
They said that was just somebody with a big backpack.
Well, I seen it looked like it had been about 40 feet tall. Yeah.
Yeah. Which I mean, who knows? You hear about the giants of Siberia that are 25. I don't think there's. I mean, I have a hard time believing there's something out there 25, 30 feet tall. But
I used to be that tall.
Did you?
Before I broke my neck.
Yeah. Did you have 4 foot neck?
Yeah. Any other questions for Les, or any other comments? Let's thank Les for his job.